Welcome back to this second mini lecture on the Sophists. Just to review the important points from the first lecture, things that you really should keep in mind for exam purposes. The first is that the Sophists move attention away from the material universe and they're interested in human behavior. Keep in mind that the Sophists look a lot like uh, a lot of political thinkers today. When we talk about Hobbes and Locke and Machiavelli and more modern political theorists, the Sophists seem very, very modern in this assumption that people are power seeking, they're egoists, they're self interested, they're skeptical. And keep in mind that the Sophists are the educational elite. They are the guardians of knowledge. The Sophists are the trainers of Athenian youth, especially the affluent or the wealthy. And keep in mind that the Sophists were essential because in a democratic society, persuasion is at the heart of political discourse, and that is exactly what the Sophists did. They taught both rhetoric and oratory, and I would underline both rhetoric and oratory. And in this particular case, the Sophists did not believe, like Socrates and Plato, and to a lesser degree Aristotle, that there were things such as justice and truth, and that there were perfect forms, and that our senses could not perceive them. And the Sophists say this is ridiculous. Things like good, evil, justice, truth, they're just social conventions. There are no universal truth. They have relative meaning depending on the society. And like Americans today, I would argue the Sophists believe that happiness is through acquiring objects that give people pleasure. And I gave you three examples: wealth, honor, status, and certainly uh, even people like Plato and Socrates go, yeah, it's true. It's true that money can buy you superficial happiness, that being a war hero or winning an award can give you some pleasure. Being recognized as someone noteworthy can give you some satisfaction. But when we get to Plato and Socrates, and again to a lesser extent Aristotle, they're going to say that that is a much more superficial form of happiness. And that's where I ended last time. Today I want to start with number 3 in your notes, moral relativism. And notice what an interesting concept this is. The Sophists believe that in Athens, the laws are merely conventional prescriptions to protect the weak from the strong. And certainly I would argue that in America today, the opposite is true. That in many cases, the law protects the strong from the weak. And certainly, if you think in terms of how the law is written in the tax code in a whole variety of ways, I would make the opposite argument for American society. Now, the Sophists compare Athenian society to nature. And the Sophists say if you take a look at nature, it's survival of the fittest. The way I have it written in the notes, it's where the powerful dominate over the weak. And so the Sophists make the claim that Athenian society is working against the laws of nature. And that if society were truly governed by the laws of nature, then it's okay to exploit the downtrodden. It's okay for people to advance their material and political gains at the expenses of other people because the laws of the states are unnatural. The law of the state inhibits great leaders. It stunts their human development. and their probability for attaining happiness. And so there's this notion of moral relativism that it's okay to advance at the expense of others. That's part of the jungle law, if you will. If you take a look in nature, the strong survive, the strong advance, and the weak go extinct, or certainly they are vulnerable to be preyed on by those that are strong. Now, it's intriguing, and I probably won't test you on this next item that's in your notes, but I wanted you to know that there are a group of political thinkers today in the 21st century in America who kind of believe the same thing. And they're called normative democratic elitists. And I have a very good friend who is a college professor who believes this. And essentially, the argument of the democratic elitists are that you should entrust the elites and not the masses to protect liberties in society, that the masses are ill-informed, the masses are ignorant, they are easily misled. And so the best guardians of a stable society and even of protecting liberties in society are the elites. And we'll talk about this, especially when we get to Plato, because Plato is certainly going to argue that the best society in a perfect world is that of a philosopher king or queen. It's interesting. 2,500 years ago, we have political theorists claiming that both men and women are equally capable of leadership and knowledge and all of those kinds of things. I underline this notion of political realism because one of the fundamental debates in political theory is this debate between political realists and political idealists. So, political realists are people who believe in this notion, remember, that power is the currency of politics, and therefore might makes right. And this fits into that moral relativism, right? There is a very famous dialogue, I said, attributed to Thucydides. Thucydides was the historian who chronicled the Peloponnesian War. And in this particular case, Thucydides talks about a group of people from this little island called Melos, so it's the Melian dialogue. And the people of Melos are basically given a choice that you can become our allies, or we can kill you off. You can either become, in essence, our political slaves, or you will die. And Thucydides says, that might makes right, that the strong do as they wish, and the weak suffer as they must. And of course, the Sophists and people who believe in this notion of political realism, like Thucydides, and later we'll talk about Machiavelli and even Hobbes, say that of course this is true. Of course, those with power wield it on those who are less powerful, and those less powerful must do as they must. And of course, the political idealists, people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who we're going to talk about in detail over the next several sections, they all said that that's not true. That in this particular case, there are ideals and there is ethical conduct, and that people should live up to these ideal standards of conduct. And that there are things that are more powerful in the long term than brute military force. And remember, I talked about force as one aspect of power, but certainly things like persuasion and lobbying and even exchange are far better uses of power than force. The Sophists, though, I think are important because they challenge some of the accepted views of the 5th century. They certainly do fit into the Ionian tradition, that there are material explanations not only for the universe but man's behavior, and that instead of looking to mythical understandings of the universe and man, look to material explanations. And even though you might argue that the Sophists are overly cynical people, as I read through the material of the Sophists, I think that they could come to America and take a look at American society and especially our political system. And I think the Sophists would say, we weren't too far off, were we? And we predicted this 24 or 2,500 years ago. I gave you one example. I'll talk a little bit more about the Sophists when I talk about Aristotle and Plato, but I just listed Protagoras. He certainly was perceived as the most prominent member of the Sophist movement. He became the first tutor that actually charged, if you will, tuition. I said fees in the notes, but tuition, using that title. Now, even though Plato was a huge critic of the Sophists, if you read the multiple books of the Republic, Plato actually depicts Protagoras as a sympathetic and dignified figure. To me, what is most intriguing about Protagoras is his close relationship with Pericles. And Pericles fascinates me. You may want to write in the notes that Pericles was the most ardent defender of democracy in the Greek world. I said that he was a general and statesman. He was the leader of Athens for over 30 years. It's 32 years to be precise. Ironically, and given the time that I'm giving this lecture, one of the things that weakened Athens and contributed to its defeat to the Spartans, besides its political system, uh, besides internal kind of dissension in a democratic state, but was a plague. Just as we have a plague today, this COVID-19 crisis, Pericles was killed, and virtually his entire family died because of a plague. Pericles to me is important because he had a significant influence on my favorite president. It's interesting. My favorite president is a Republican, Abraham Lincoln, and Pericles heavily influenced Abraham Lincoln. In fact, the last thing that Abraham Lincoln read before he wrote the Gettysburg Address was Pericles' funeral oration, and both of them are for you to watch. And if you want to earn a little extra credit, you can write a response. I'm not going to grade them difficultly. I just want your honest reactions to them. And if you put a little bit of effort into it, I'm going to give you the 5 points. But certainly, I find lots of parallels in them. By the way, my second favorite president of all time is a Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt. So my favorite's a Republican. My second favorite is a Democrat. My third favorite's George Washington, who isn't a Democrat or a Republican. So if you look at my top three, one Democrat, one Republican, one other. So the Sophists are important figures. You should know. I will ask you on the exam who is the most ardent defender of democracy in the ancient Greek world, and it's Pericles. He was a believer in the common man, sort of like Thomas Jefferson. He believed that common people were capable of great deeds and that all of us could contribute in a democratic society. In the next mini lecture, I will move away from the Sophists and move to Socrates.